Berlin, the 30th of April, 1945. The world was ending, at least for the men buried beneath the Reich Chancellery. Above them, firestorms devoured the remnants of the Nazi capital. Soviet artillery pounded the streets in a rhythm that felt like judgment. And beneath it all, in the choking air of concrete corridors, a single man walked forward not to fight, but to speak. General Helmuth Weidling carried in his hands a final message. He believed, or at least hoped, that the words inside it might save thousands of lives. But to deliver it, he would need to pass through 3 layers of security, meant to keep even the most powerful men out. The man he needed to see Adolf Hitler was no longer a political leader. He was a deluded, caged figure, clinging to an empire that existed only in his own imagination. Weidling had been appointed commander of the Berlin defense area just days prior. He was, effectively, the last man standing between the Red Army and the total collapse of Nazi resistance in the capital, but he was no fanatic. He saw what others refused to see. Berlin was lost. Resistance had become a form of suicide, and yet inside the bunker, reality had no place. His first obstacle was the Führerbunker, the forward bunker, compared to what lay ahead. This was the easy part. A guard sat at a desk, his face pale with fatigue, eyes twitching toward every distant explosion. Weidling approached, handed over his identification, and spoke plainly. "I am General Helmuth Weidling. I must see the Führer." There was no salute, no ceremony, just a quiet nod. The soldier reached down and tapped a simple 2-signal code. With a mechanical hiss, the hermetic seal disengaged. The door opened. Weidling stepped inside, but deeper into the earth, steel turned to paranoia. The further one traveled, the more oxygen seemed to vanish. The heavier the concrete pressed down from above, the corridors were shielded by ceilings over 9 feet thick. The floors below him were built to withstand bombs, more than 8 feet of reinforced concrete. Yet even here, surrounded by all this armor, it was not the explosions that inspired fear. It was the men, the decisions, the desperation. The war was no longer collapsing. It had already collapsed. Allied forces had swept through Germany like a tide, taking Nuremberg, Munich, Hamburg. What remained of the Wehrmacht was scattered, broken, or surrendered. But in the heart of Berlin, in this buried tomb of command, there were still men pretending to plan victories. The Führerbunker held a grotesque parody of normal life, a dining room where vegetarian meals were prepared for Hitler, air filtration systems running at full capacity to protect against imagined gas attacks, storage rooms stocked with what little food was left, and then there was the next gate, the entrance to the Führerbunker. This was not simply another checkpoint. It was a psychological threshold where ideology became delusion, where escape was treason, and where proximity to Hitler meant increasing certainty of death. Weidling reached the guard. "I must speak with the Führer," he said. The guard glanced down at Weidling's identification, then, with a hard stare, asked, "What is your business?" Weidling's answer was curt. "That's not for you to know." This was not defiance. It was protocol. In these final days, secrecy and suspicion ruled all. The guard picked up the telephone. Seconds passed. Then came the words Weidling needed. "Your weapons, please." He surrendered his pistol. The door opened again. The second gate fell, but the third would not be so simple. As he descended deeper, a man emerged from the shadows, Wilhelm Bergdorf, a general and Hitler's adjutant. His face was drained, his tone suspicious. "What do you want?" he demanded. Weidling responded, I must speak to the Führer immediately. The Führer is not available. I will deliver your message. This message, Weidling said, is for the Führer directly. Bergdorf hesitated. His eyes flicked to the soldiers beside him. Their hands inched toward their rifles. No one trusted anyone anymore. Treachery had become a daily expectation. And then a sound above them, an impact, a thunderclap of concrete. Dust fell from the ceiling. A shell had landed nearby. That was all it took. Bergdorf motioned Weidling forward. Follow me. The final checkpoint was passed, but inside, the air grew colder still. You can almost imagine yourself there. The dull hum of generators trying to keep the lights on, the mold creeping into every crack, the exhausted typewriters sitting still, and the women who once used them, now silent, waiting. The bunker had become a mausoleum for ambition, for war, and soon, for its architect. As Weidling stepped into the Führer's chamber, he was struck not by power, but by frailty. Hitler sat slumped in a worn chair. His once rigid posture had given way to the unmistakable curvature of decay. His left hand trembled uncontrollably. Parkinson's, they said. His face, sallow and waxen, bore the weight not just of 56 years, but of a crumbling Reich and 1,000 decisions that had led to annihilation. The air around him was thick with sweat and paranoia. The scent of unwashed bodies and stale tobacco clinging to every surface. The walls were lined with maps, but they no longer reflected reality. Colored pens and scribbled notations told stories that no longer existed. Berlin, in those maps, still had defensive integrity. The lines of Soviet encroachment had been halted, even reversed, by phantom units that lived only in the imagination of the bunker's occupants. On paper, it looked like there was hope. But General Weidling knew better. He bowed slightly enough to show respect, but not submission. Then he held out the message, "My Führer." He said, "This is a request for permission to break out, to save the lives that remain." Hitler looked at him with eyes that seemed not to see. For several long seconds, there was only the distant sound of shelling, muffled by tons of concrete. Then came Hitler's reply. Flat, mechanical. There will be no breakout. But the lines do not exist. Hitler interrupted, his voice cracking. "We will stand and fight." Weidling hesitated. "My Führer, if we do not..." Hitler's hand slammed the armrest. His voice rose, but barely carried the weight it once had. "We will die in Berlin." He meant it. There would be no retreat, no surrender, no evacuation. The city and the people in it were to become a funeral pyre. Weidling stood silently for a moment, then nodded. He turned and left without another word. There was nothing left to say. Back in the corridor, Bergdorf met him once more. But this time, there was a strange softness in the man's demeanor. He did not mock, did not threaten. Instead, he said quietly, "It's almost over." Weidling nodded. And he left a general without an army, a man with clarity among ruins. Just one floor above, another scene unfolded, one that spoke volumes about the disintegration of this once imperial cult. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, had moved his wife Magda and their 6 children into the bunker. The children blonde-haired, blue-eyed, the supposed ideal of Aryan innocence played in the hallway. They still laughed, still sang, but everyone who passed them knew what Magda Goebbels had already decided. They would not live to see Germany occupied. She had already spoken to the doctors, already requested the poison. In her mind, death was mercy or loyalty. Depending on how one looked at it, she would not allow her children to be raised by Bolsheviks, she claimed. And so, in this bunker, beneath the final heartbeat of a dead regime, a mother planned the murder of her own children, and Goebbels, he had made peace with it. His devotion to Hitler was total. When others had fled or questioned, he remained. His final radio broadcast still praised the Führer, still warned of conspiracies, still blamed Jews, Bolsheviks, and cowards. Even as Soviet tanks rolled through Charlottenburg, elsewhere in the bunker, Martin Bormann schemed to escape. Eva Braun smiled through the dread, pretending that her marriage to Hitler set to happen in mere hours would somehow give meaning to their final moments, and the secretaries, especially Traudl Junge, wrote furiously, taking dictation, preparing last wills, typing Hitler's final political testament. Even as the walls seemed ready to cave in, it was a bunker filled with ghosts, some still breathing. But outside, the Red Army was not waiting. Marshal Zhukov had unleashed his full fury. The Battle of Berlin was more than conquest. It was vengeance. The Soviets remembered the atrocities of the Eastern Front, Stalingrad, Kursk, the siege of Leningrad, the mass graves of civilians and partisans, and now they had come for the Reich's capital with artillery, tanks, and righteous rage. More than 5 million Soviet troops surrounded Berlin by late April. Their shells reduced entire city blocks to dust. Their Katyusha rocket launchers, the infamous Stalin's organs, screamed across the sky. They advanced street by street, house by house, crushing German resistance beneath treads and fire. By the 28th of April, the Reichstag was within reach. And yet, inside the Führerbunker, Hitler was preparing for a wedding. That evening, in a dim lit konkrete room, he married Eva Braun. There were no flowers, no guest, no music, just two witnesses, Goebbels and Bormann. The ceremony took minutes, and afterward, Hitler handed out cyanide capsules, his final gifts. Later, alone with Eva, he promised her that they would never be captured, never paraded in a cage. They would die as he had always claimed he would in Berlin. When the time comes, he told her, we'll go together. The next morning, Hitler summoned his aides one final time. To Traudl Junge, he handed a sealed envelope. It contained his will and political statement. To the guards, he gave orders no one was to disturb him between 3:00 and 4:00 p.m. Then he and Eva Braun retired to their private room. At precisely 3:30 p.m., a single gunshot rang out. When the guards opened the door moments later, they found Hitler slumped on the couch, a bullet wound in his right temple, his pistol on the floor. Eva Braun lay beside him, lips blue from the poison. Goebbels identified the bodies. The corpses were doused in petrol and set alight in the garden above the bunker, as per Hitler's instructions, but the fire was weak. The body half burned, ashes indistinguishable from rubble. Thus ended the life of the man who had thrown the world into war. No grand finale, no tribunal, no last words to the world, just fire, smoke, and silence. But for the others still in the bunker, there was no silence, only decisions. With Hitler dead, the illusion of authority disintegrated instantly. Martin Bormann moved to seize what little remained of power, forging documents and issuing commands under the weight of the Führer's last will. But outside the bunker, no one cared. No orders mattered anymore. The Reich was leaderless. rudderless. A shattered machine still grinding its gears in empty defiance. Joseph Goebbels stepped into the vacuum. In the hours after Hitler's death, Goebbels declared himself Reich Chancellor. It was a title with no meaning, a ghostly crown atop a dying man. But he insisted on it. He drafted his own farewell letters. He called on the remaining German units in Berlin to keep fighting for the honor of the Reich. But deep down, he knew it was over. Magda Goebbels had already prepared the children. On May 1st, she dressed them in their best clothes. She kissed each one, whispered words that no one could hear. Then, one by one, with the help of Ludwig Stumpfegger, Hitler's personal physician, she administered the poison. The children were sedated first. Then, cyanide. It was quiet, no struggle, just a silence that settled into the walls like smoke. Moments later, Joseph and Magda Goebbels climbed the stairs to the courtyard. A guard handed them a pistol. They walked outside, stood beneath the blackened sky, and ended their lives. Inside, the bunker began to empty. Some officers tried to flee. Others shot themselves in the hallways. The sound of gunfire echoed off the reinforced concrete, indistinguishable from the Soviet bombardment overhead. The bunker, once the brain of an empire, had become a mausoleum of suicides. But not everyone chose death. General Weidling, still clinging to a shred of humanity, made one final move. He contacted Soviet commanders. On May 2nd, Berlin formally surrendered. It was over. At precisely 7:50 a.m., the last defenders of the city laid down their arms. Soviet troops surged into the Chancellery complex. They seized the garden, the ruins, the bunker itself. They found the charred remains of two bodies outside, believed to be Hitler and Eva Braun, but they were barely recognizable. Still, it was enough. Zhukov reported to Stalin. The madman was dead. But Stalin did not believe it, not entirely. He ordered the remains collected, analyzed, hidden. The corpse was buried, unburied, moved again and again. For years, its location would be a state secret. Disinformation was seeded. Was Hitler truly dead? Had they escaped? The Soviet Union fueled the rumors, both as propaganda and as strategic uncertainty. But those who were there knew the truth. Hitler had died. The Reich had died with him. And yet, the echoes lingered. Traudl Junge, the secretary who had typed Hitler's final words, survived. She was captured, interrogated, released. In her later years, she confessed that she hadn't realized what she had been part of, not truly until long after the war. I was so naive, she said, and I never asked. Many of Hitler's inner circle perished in those final days. Some in the bunker, others in Soviet custody. Wilhelm Burgdorf and Hans Krebs, both high-ranking officers, shot themselves on May 1st. Stumpfegger, the doctor who killed the Goebbels children, fled with Bormann, but was believed to have died in the attempt. Bormann himself vanished for decades. For years, his fate was a mystery. Some claimed he had escaped to South America. Others swore they had seen him in Moscow. But in 1972, construction workers in Berlin uncovered a skeleton near the Loerder train station. Dental records confirmed it. Bormann had died in May 1945, likely from suicide during the breakout attempt. And yet, uncertainty remained. Myths fed on the vacuum. The world would not move on easily. Back in Moscow, Stalin used the fall of Berlin to bolster his own legend. The Red Army had not only defeated the Nazis, they had conquered their capital. Statues went up. Medals were issued. But beneath the triumph, a new Cold War was already forming. The Soviet occupation of Berlin was no end. It was a prologue to division. The city would be split, the bunker sealed, Germany partitioned, and the ghosts of the bunker, they lingered. Even in 2020, decades after the war, visitors still walk above the garden where Hitler's body was burned. A parking lot now covers the site. A small sign offers context, but there are no shrines, no statues, just gray pavement and history buried beneath it. Inside that bunker, 1,000 choices were made. Most were terrible. Some were cowardly. A few, like General Weidling's, tried to salvage dignity from madness. But history would remember them all. The bunker was not just a place, it was a final test. A crucible where belief collided with reality, where loyalty became murder, and where the end of one man became the rebirth of the world he had tried to destroy. As Berlin smoldered under Soviet boots, the war in Europe ended, but the war against truth had just begun. The Nazi regime had died in a bunker, but the ideology that animated it was far from buried. From the moment the flames licked the bodies of Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun in the Chancellery courtyard, two narratives began to compete. One was historical, the other mythological. Stalin, master of paranoia, personally fueled the latter. Though his intelligence officers confirmed Hitler's death, he chose ambiguity. He instructed his generals to remain vague. Western Allied leaders were told the body had not been conclusively found. The cremation had made identification difficult. Soviet investigators could not be sure. This was not confusion. It was strategy. If Hitler were missing, then his ghost could be used as a justification for occupation, as an excuse for surveillance, as a perpetual source of fear. If the West believed the Führer had escaped, they might become more pliable. If Germany feared his return, they might resist less. And if Stalin's own people believed he had vanquished not just the body, but the myth, then his victory became eternal. Thus began the most enduring conspiracy of the 20th century, that Hitler had somehow survived. Within months, whispers spread to Argentina, to Spain, to Antarctica. British tabloids picked up the rumors. American newspapers speculated. Books appeared. Hitler's escape route, the Fourth Reich underground. In some versions, he fled via submarine. In others, he hid in the Andes. Plotting a return, there was no evidence, but the absence of evidence became its own kind of proof. In the vacuum of closure, myths flourish. For West Germany, the need to believe in Hitler's death was existential. The fledgling Federal Republic could not emerge if the monster still lurked in shadow. The Allies, too, needed finality. The Nuremberg trials would carry the moral weight of justice, but only if their chief architect lay dead. So Western governments declared it. Hitler was gone. But beneath that declaration ran a question far more unsettling. If Hitler died, why did so many of his ideas survive? The fall of Berlin marked not just the defeat of a regime, but the exposure of a civilization's darkest capacities. The world had seen the death camps, Auschwitz, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, millions exterminated not in chaos, but by design. Bureaucracy had enabled it. Engineers had refined it. Ordinary men and women had enforced it. In the bunker, Hitler died, but outside, his legacy infected everything. The scientists who built the V-2 rockets, including Wernher von Braun, were scooped up by the United States in Operation Paperclip. They were not tried. They were hired, They helped put men on the moon. The intelligence officers of the SS and Gestapo, many found second lives in the Cold War. Working for both East and West, knowledge was currency. Morality was negotiable. The ideology itself, that toxic mixture of nationalism, racial purity, authoritarian worship, found new names, new languages. It never disappeared. It adapted in Argentina, in Spain, and even parts of post-war Europe. Fascist sympathies lived on, and within Germany, the scars were deep. The Germans who survived the war emerged into rubble, cities flattened, families shattered, entire towns gone. In this devastation, there was no time and often no desire to process guilt. Survival demanded forgetfulness. For years, former Nazis quietly returned to public life. Teachers, judges, engineers. The question of complicity was buried beneath the economic miracle of the 1950s, but the children of those survivors asked different questions. By the 1960s and 1970s, a new generation of Germans began to probe the silences. They asked what their parents had done, where they had been, what they had seen or ignored. Some rejected the old patriotism outright. Others turned to radical politics. The specter of the bunker never left. In that space, sealed, airless, delusional, the Third Reich had spent its final days denying the world it had destroyed. That denial, too, became part of history. The physical bunker itself became an object of obsession. After the war, the Soviets attempted to destroy it. They dynamited the upper structures, collapsed portions of the complex, filled the corridors with rubble, but the concrete refused to disappear. Decades later, sections of it still remained too massive, too deep, too engineered to simply vanish. In 1989, as the Berlin Wall fell and Germany reunified, interest in the bunker surged again. Tourists asked, scholars examined, survivors were interviewed, but Germany made a decision. They would not preserve the bunker. No museum, no shrine, no dark tourism. Instead, they paved it over, built a parking lot, put up a small sign, and yet people still come. They stand on the pavement, uncertain of the exact spot. They whisper, they wonder, not out of reverence, but to understand, to comprehend how such a place existed, how a man like Hitler could rise, how millions followed. The answers are never simple, because what died in that bunker was not just a man, but an entire illusion. The illusion of invincibility, the illusion of racial destiny, the illusion that one man could bend history to his will forever. Hitler's body burned, but his rise, his crimes, his fall, those remain etched in the consciousness of the world. And the bunker, though invisible now, still lies beneath the surface. Waiting, in every empire's death, there is a final refuge, not of safety, but of delusion. For Napoleon, it was exile in a damp room on St. Helena. For Caesar, it was the Senate chamber, surrounded by knives. For Hitler, it was the bunker. But the real tragedy is not that such places exist. It's that men, movements, and millions often follow their leaders into them willingly, even blindly. The Führerbunker was not a mere shelter. It was an echo chamber where reality was exiled and fantasy ruled. There, Hitler imagined armies that no longer existed, issued orders to generals who were already dead or captured, spoke of counterattacks that would never come. He died believing that Germany had failed him, not that he had failed Germany. It is a lesson that still haunts the modern world. The danger of systems so closed, so insulated, that they lose all tether to reality. Where dissent is erased, where truth is optional, where loyalty to a leader outweighs loyalty to life itself. And yet, even in that final den of fanaticism, not everyone surrendered to madness. General Helmuth Weidling, who had once been willing to fight for Hitler's orders, defied them in the end. He ordered the surrender of Berlin. He did so knowing it might cost him his life, knowing that fanatics in the bunker might shoot him for treason. He acted not for ideology, but for life, for sanity, for the thousands of soldiers and civilians who would have died in a pointless last stand. Therein lies the paradox of the bunker. It was the grave of a dictator, but also a crucible of choice. Inside, men and women were stripped of illusion. They either clung to myth or stepped into reality. And that division, that line between those who saw and those who refused, still divides humanity today. But the story of the bunker is not just about Germany. It is about how power ends, not with a bang, but with silence behind sealed doors, not with glory, but with poison and paranoia, not with victory, but with erasure. What remains of the Third Reich's final days are fragments, testimonies from survivors, scorched documents, blurred photographs of charred corpses, no triumphant last speech, no grand collapse, just a dull, desperate unraveling of men who once thought themselves gods. And beyond the physical, something deeper lingers, a kind of psychological radiation. In every society, there are those drawn to power like moths to flame, who mistake strength for cruelty, who see unity in conformity, who would follow a man like Hitler, not because of what he promises, but because he offers certainty in uncertain times. The bunker reminds us that such certainty is always a lie. History does not bend to will alone. It demands truth, complexity, consequences. In modern Berlin, a new city has risen. Glass towers, cafes, art, laughter, life. The ghosts are still there, but they do not rule. Where once the SS marched, students protest. Where Goebbels lied, journalists report. Where walls once stood, bridges span, but the parking lot still remains quiet. Gray, unremarkable. A few feet below, the final chapter of a nightmare still echoes in reinforced concrete. No plaque, no flowers, no monuments, just a question. What will we do when we build our own bunkers? Not of concrete, but of belief, of fear, of obedience. Will we recognize them in time, or will we, like so many before, step inside and lock the door behind us? Final words from the ruins. Empires do not fall because they are defeated. They fall because they rot from within. The Führerbunker was not an accident. It was the inevitable consequence of a regime built on lies, violence, and blind faith. The world watched one man destroy a continent, but in the end, he could not even save himself. He died underground, surrounded by ruins, betrayed by his own delusions, and above him, as the fires burned and the city cracked open, a new world began to take shape. A world that still remembers and still asks, will we recognize the next bunker before it is too late? Thank you for joining us on this journey through the shadows of history. If this story moved you, made you reflect, or sparked new questions, consider subscribing to Legacy Files, where the past is not just remembered, but understood